Hello, my name is Sascha Clark Danylchuk. I run Keep Fish Wet. We are a US-based nonprofit, and we work on conservation issues related to recreational fishing, in particular catch and release and best practices for fish handling. So with any discussion, I think it's really important to talk about the scale of recreational angling. And worldwide, there are several 100 million people who fish every year, creating billions of dollars of economic value. And in the US, we have about 50 million recreational anglers every year, and there's about $50 billion that's contributed to the US economy through that. In Australia, it's a little bit smaller. The numbers that I could find show about 3.4 million anglers and $1.8 billion to the economy. It's also important to think about what's happening to these fish. In the US, we're releasing more fish than are being kept every year. We release almost 60% of all of our fish. And a lot of agencies have some estimations that they use for post-release mortality of those fish. A lot of the agencies in the US use a number of about 10% of fish, and that would be 20 million fish that are lost every year from our fisheries. And if we can lower those numbers by just a little bit, even by 1%, that means 2 million more fish would be swimming in our lakes, rivers, and oceans every year. Now, it's also important to think about why anglers release fish. We often think of catch and release as a voluntary practice, but it's not only through voluntary actions that anglers release fish. Depending on the location, things like size limits or closed seasons, a lot of different regulations mandate the release of some fish. And so nearly all anglers are releasing fish at least some of the time when they're going out, regardless of what their ultimate aim is. We can use this example of the Bahamian bonefish fishery. We've got a lot of data on a number of different aspects of the fishery. And so we have some economic data that shows us that it's a fairly high value fishery. It contributes about $70 million to the economy every year. And it's actually big enough that it's kind of a main economic driver on some of the smaller islands in the Bahamas. We've also had a number of studies looking at post-release mortality rates of bonefish, and those can range between 0 to about 40%. And a lot of the reason of that kind of higher mortality has to do with post-release predation due to shark attacks or barracuda attacks. If we were to use kind of a middle of the road mortality estimate, somewhere around 17%, then nearly $12 million in fish are being lost from that fishery every year. And again, if we look at changing that mortality rate, even by 1%, that would mean almost 10,000 fish staying in the fishery every year and nearly $1 million. So we know that lowering mortality rates would have a biological impact and an economic impact. And if we look at what it would take to lower those mortality rates, we can see that it's absolutely possible. And this was a study that was done looking at the role of equilibrium as it relates to post-release mortality, in particular post-release predation. And we can see that fish that lost equilibrium, meaning they could nosedive or roll, did not have coordinated fin movement, were 6 times more likely to suffer post-release predation than fish that did not lose equilibrium. You can see from the top line here on the graph, the green line, fish that had equilibrium had almost a 90% chance of survival, and fish that lost equilibrium prior to release had less than a 60% chance of survival. The primary drivers of loss of equilibrium for these fish were air exposure and handling duration. Things that were not significant were length, bleeding, and the duration of fight. So air exposure and duration of handling are absolutely things that are within an angler's control, that an angler can change to change the mortality rate of those fish. If we take a wider view of catch and release, we know that it's been used as a management tool, as a conservation tool for a very long time. But the science on what happens to fish that are caught and released is really a fairly new area of study. Most of the studies have been done in the last 30 years. Half of them in the last decade alone. But we have a pretty substantial amount of research in this area now, somewhere over 400 studies. And a lot of those studies point to best practices, things that can be done to create better outcomes for fish, tools that anglers can use that will help fish survive and be healthy. So we know that there's a biological imperative and economic imperative to use best practices. But then the next question, and really we feel like this is the most important piece of the puzzle, is how do we change angler behavior? And really we're talking about changing social norms, what anglers do when they practice catch and release. And there are a couple tools that we use that have been successful so far. One is that we're a grassroots organization. We are a group of anglers for anglers. And that kind of bottom-up approach has been really successful, not being a kind of top-down type organization helps. We also know that it's really important to not only tell a story, but also find ways to illustrate it, using good imagery, using good infographics, finding all sorts of different ways to show and tell, to talk about this sort of information is really important. So is being science-based. Anglers have lots of theories of, the best times to catch fish, the best flies or lures to use to catch fish. They're very good or we as anglers are very good at coming up with these stories. And that anecdotal information can be great, but being science-based and relying on the science for our best practices has really kind of given us a backbone and something to fall back upon. We also go through a lot of time and effort to provide explanations, talking about fish biology and ecology and making sure that we're providing not just we're providing a reason why we're encouraging anglers to use best practices or what those best practices are. It's equally important that we allow a space for people to be wrong. We're asking people to change, and if we don't provide the space for anglers to be able to make that change, then they're not going to change. So we talk about that this is a process, and probably nobody started out handling fish perfectly. but that everybody can always improve. And likewise, encouraging good behavior and not shaming bad behavior. We find when there's shaming or calling out going on, that is not a process that helps create change in anybody. So back to keep fish wet and what we do, and some of what we talk about with anglers. We are focused really primarily on what's within an angler's control. There are things that are outside an angler's control that make a difference to post-release mortality. But we really are trying to focus our best practices of what anglers can do. What are the things that will make the most amount of difference for fish survival that they have control over? Again, we're science-based, not purely anecdotal. And we spend a lot of time talking about how this is putting conservation into practice. Every time you catch a fish, it's a one-on-one opportunity to practice conservation by using best practices. And that helps create more resiliency within our fisheries. We also spend time talking about what we are not. And there's 4 things listed here, all of them important. We are, that first one, especially, that we're not saying that you should only be practicing catch and release. We're fine with illegal harvest of fish. Our roots are in fly fishing, but we're not just a fly fishing practice. These best practices can be applied to any type of fishing in any type of water body anywhere in the world. We're also not telling anglers that they should never, ever, ever take fish out of water. We get that people want photos and that not everybody has a fancy underwater camera, but we do provide some tips and tricks that anglers can use to get a more fish-friendly photo. And again, we refrain and encourage others not to shame or call out fellow anglers for what they see as bad behavior. This is happening more and more on social media, and it just creates more divisions within the recreational angling community. So our work is predominantly focused on education and outreach about best practices. Our roots are really within social media. We started as a social media movement, and so that's always been really important to us. It's been a channel for our education and outreach, and we've expanded that as we've grown. We use our website a lot more and other tools, but social media is still a really important conduit for information for us. And then we really focus our work on 3 different groups, to anglers, guides, shops and lodges, and then brands or tackle manufacturers. We have 3 programs that focus on anglers. Excuse me. The first one is our advocate program, and that is our newest program. A lot of nonprofits, especially in the United States, are membership based. So you pay a fee every year to help support that nonprofit. But we really wanted to reduce those barriers to entry, and we felt like this information and education should be free and available for all anglers. So our advocate program is kind of our answer to that. It is a pledge-based program. Anglers can go on our website. You take a pledge to use our best practices, and that kind of brings you in as an angler advocate. And then that program also allows us to provide more information. And one of the ways we do that is through some online curricula. This is more species or location-based best practices. So we can get into some of the details about, how do you handle brown trout versus a bonefish, for example. And it also creates some opportunities for us to form coalitions or work with other organizations on different issues. There's a photo down here from one of the online programs that we're working on right now with the Yukon in Canada. So that one's more location based. And then we also use ambassadors. I don't always love the term influencers because it's got some negative connotations, but really we see our ambassadors as role models, people to set examples. And they are often guides or fly tyers, kind of more known anglers. And those are people that we find many anglers look up to and look to for resources. So our ambassador program kind of can help be set an example for anglers. So our work with guide shops and lodges is really focused on providing information that they can get out to their clients. We see guide shops and lodges as a choke point for anglers, and they all work with hundreds and hundreds of anglers every year. So our ability to partner with one lodge means that that lodge can get information about best practices out to hundreds of anglers every year. So really it's about scalability for us. There's two main programs that we have right now focused on this area. One is a Guiding for the Future program. It's an advanced conservation guide training program, and we partner with them. They're started in Montana, and so it's all trout focused, and a lot of it Montana based, although they've expanded to some surrounding states as well. But we're working with them too on expanding that guide training program to other locations and for other species. And then the second thing that we do is a best practices toolkit, and this is just coming online for us in 2021. And really this is providing educational resources for guide shops and lodges to, again, help educate their client base. One major point of feedback that we often get from guides is that it's really hard to tell a paying client that they're not allowed to bring that fish out of the water to take a photo, and that what would be helpful for them is having enough resources to kind of back up what they know is best for those fish. So some of what we're doing with this toolkit is being able to provide those that material to guides so that they can help not only work with their human clients but their fish clients as well. So our programs for brands and manufacturers are a little bit different than the angler-based programs or the guide shops and lodge-based programs. One, this is one of our conduits for fundraising. So some of it is just different kind of donations and partnerships that we have with brands and manufacturers. We also do some work helping brands kind of change, especially a lot of their photo standards for social media and magazine ads, trying to get them to have more fish-friendly photos. And we call this unofficial work because a lot of those manufacturers, we found we get further without making it a you're in or you're out of type of program. So it's kind of a softer push, I guess you could say, with a lot of the brands and manufacturers. We've also started to do some co-branding, talking about different tools that anglers can use without kind of pushing marketing for any one company. We get a lot of anglers who are wanting to know, so what is the best type of net that I should be using? And so being able to provide information about products that are available on the market to anglers that are more fish friendly has been something that we find a lot of anglers want to know about. And then we've started to work a bit with tournaments. We've worked for the last 2 years with one of the biggest fly fishing tournaments in the United States. It's about 500 anglers every year, and their tournament is all based on size, and you have to take a photo of your fish. So we've worked with them to change the requirements of the tournament so that fish have to be kept in the water. Excuse me. So those are the areas where we focus our work. When we get down to actually what we are talking to anglers about, some of the best practices that we're using, we have taken all those studies on catch and release, and we have created 2 different categories of best practices. The first one is our principles. And there's just 3 of them, and these are the things that anglers can do that will make the most amount of difference to fish health and survival after release. If anglers can remember to use these 3 principles, it will make a huge difference for the fish that they're catching and releasing. Our first principle is to minimize air exposure, and we use a kind of 10 seconds rule. And that really comes from the science, is that for most species, you know, they found that 10 seconds or less is okay. The great thing about that number is that it's also plenty of time for anglers to get a photograph. So we talk a lot, and I'll mention this a little bit later, you know, different ways that anglers can use that 10-second rule to get a really good photo. And then we also talk about why air exposure is harmful to fish, and a lot of conversations about how fish gills work. We're surprised by the number of even expert anglers who don't have a very good understanding of the functionality of fish gills. So we talk about lamellae and concurrent flow and all those sorts of good things. Our second principle is to eliminate contact with dry surfaces, and really the goal there is to keep the slime layer of fish intact. So we're talking about different net types that anglers can use, avoiding dragging fish up on the shore, especially rocks or sand, not bringing fish into a boat because fish are slimy and floppy creatures, and inevitably you're going to drop one at some point. And all that, how it goes back to keeping slime layers intact. And then our third principle is to reduce handling time. And really the focus here is that handling is anything that you're doing to a fish from landing to release, and that you want that time period to be as short as possible. So it doesn't matter if you're holding a fish in your hands or in a net, you want to get that fish back in the water swimming on its way as quickly as possible. We often use the analogy that you know, fish are wild animals, and just like a lion that's put in a cage, a fish in a net that's a stressful situation for those animals. So we want to release them as quickly as possible. So the second way that we arrange our best practices is through tips. And these are more specific things that anglers can do. Most of them support those 3 principles in some way, but also not all of these tips are applicable to every type of angling situation. So they're a little bit more varied. They range from things like following local regulations, being wary of warm water, using barbless hooks, carrying some sort of hook removal device, whether that's a pair of pliers or hemostats or a specially designed hook removal device, just having something other than your fingers to remove a hook. And then photographing wet fish. And then we go into detail with all of these as well on our websites and during our presentations about how to implement these tips. We also spend some time talking about some of the things that are outside of an angler's control. And water temperature is one of those things that gets asked about again and again and again. We are just going into winter here in the United States, but this summer it was really, really hot across a lot of areas of North America. And we have a lot of followers who are trout anglers, so we got a lot of questions about water temperature and what anglers can be doing. So we always spend a little bit of time talking about water temperature as well, and not only how it plays such an important role for fish as cold-blooded animals, but also that as water temperature increases, fish become more susceptible to the impacts of catch and release. And using some different studies like the one here on Atlantic salmon and how that impacts mortality really helps anglers understand why water temperature is so important. And then we talk about photography as well with smartphones and almost every angler having a phone when they go fishing. We see the number of pictures that are posted on social media, or just in general, the number of pictures that anglers are taking of their fish increasing exponentially. And so we work with professional photographers and guides to help provide information about how to get fish-friendly photos. And a lot of what that comes down to is just reminding anglers that you can still follow these principles and tips and get really good photos. We talk about, how to do this in different situations as well, whether you're wading in a river, fishing from a boat with really high sides so you can't even reach the water. How do you do this with big fish? How do you do this with little fish? And then even some tools that anglers can use to get better in underwater photos of their fish. And then also reminding anglers to be mindful of conditions, and that there are some times when they might want to decide to forego taking a photo. For example, going back to the last slide, if it's really hot, it might not be a good day to try to take a bunch of photos of your fish. So that's sort of the basis of what we do and where we focus a lot of our work. We're always trying to remind anglers that using best practices is your opportunity to put conservation into practice, and that every time you go catch a fish, that you can use these best practices, and that this is a process, and that it all adds up and makes a difference. That if you look at the size of recreational fishing, if we have enough people changing the way that they practice catch and release enough of the time, that we can make a huge difference overall. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, and feel free to reach out. There's information on our website if you'd like to get in touch with us. Thank you.